They called her the Blood Countess. Behind the frostbitten walls of a forgotten Hungarian castle, something unspeakable unfolded. Noble daughters vanished. Servant girls were never seen again. And in the silence of stone corridors, rumors took shape. Of screams at night. Of pale bodies drained and discarded. Of a woman who believed that beauty could be stolen, that youth could be kept, if one was willing to pay the price in blood. Tonight, we begin the haunting story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Countess who bathed in blood. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Let the stillness take over. If you're new here, you're welcome to join us. Subscribe to The Sleepy Planet, where every week we explore the darker corners of real history. Stories whispered through centuries, told slowly, beneath the hush of night. Now breathe out, and when you're ready, we'll return to the castle walls where it all began. Long before she earned the title of the most prolific female murderer in recorded history, she was simply a child born into power. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, born in 1560 into one of the most influential and ancient noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her family's reach stretched far beyond castle walls. They were connected to kings, cardinals, and high-ranking officials across Central Europe. The Bathorys owned land, wealth, titles, and armies. But behind the lineage of gold and banners was a darker inheritance, one woven into the Bathory name long before Elizabeth was born. The Bathory bloodline was split into two powerful branches: the Exid branch, to which Elizabeth belonged, and the Somlyo branch, which had produced several princes of Transylvania. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, would become Prince of Transylvania, and later King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. The family's influence ran across the spine of Europe. But with power came corruption, and something more troubling. The Bathory name was marked, even in their own time, by madness, brutality, and whispers of occult interest. In later years, scholars and psychologists would look back at the Bathory genealogy and remark on the pattern of epilepsy, psychotic behavior, and sudden rages, especially in Elizabeth's immediate line. From a young age, Elizabeth suffered from violent seizures, thought by some to be connected to epilepsy, possibly inherited through generations of noble inbreeding. Physicians at the time had no language to describe such episodes beyond superstition. Local healers tried herbal remedies. Some may have offered bloodletting. The elite did not suffer illness. They were said to be cursed or touched by unnatural forces. Her childhood was shaped not just by illness, but by exposure to violence that few today would consider survivable. At a time when the Ottoman Empire constantly raided Hungarian lands, violence was a normal part of noble life. From the high towers of the family estates, children like Elizabeth often witnessed the execution of servants, torture of prisoners, and the cruelty of discipline meted out in the open. It was said that one of her relatives, perhaps an uncle, introduced her to witchcraft, alchemical theories, and satanic texts, not unusual in 16th century aristocratic circles, where the occult and religion often overlapped. There are rumors, likely exaggerated, that Elizabeth witnessed human sacrifice or animal mutilation as part of private rituals. Whether these stories are true or simply embellished by later historians is debated. But the interest in esoteric rites and blood rituals would echo through her later trial. She received an elite education for a woman of her time. She spoke Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. She could read and write, Few women in 16th century Europe were as well educated. But education did not mean empathy. In noble circles, peasants were property. Servants were disposable. Those beneath her status were not considered fully human in the eyes of law or custom. At the age of 10, Elizabeth was formally betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another aristocratic Hungarian family, also wealthy, also brutal. Ferenc was 5 years older and would eventually earn the nickname the Black Knight of Hungary for his ruthlessness against the Ottomans. He too had been raised in the fire of war and blood. It was a union not of love, but of land, influence, and shared cruelty. Some historians believe Elizabeth gave birth to an illegitimate child before her marriage, the father allegedly a lower-class man. This claim comes from trial testimonies decades later and remains unproven. Still, if true, the child would have been taken away at birth, possibly killed or adopted out. The scandal was kept buried, and Elizabeth's path toward marriage continued. At age 14, she married Ferenc, taking on his surname and moving into Castle Choctich, a remote fortress in present-day Slovakia. As a wedding gift, the Nadasdy family granted her the castle and its surrounding villages, over 17 settlements in total. Ferenc was often away at war, fighting the Turks. In his absence, Elizabeth was left in full command of the estate, a rare power for a woman of her time. What kind of girl was she truly when she walked through the halls of Choctich for the first time? Was she already cruel, as some believe? Or had she simply inherited too much land, too much trauma, too many secrets? The people who worked the fields below her windows whispered from the beginning. They said their lady did not sleep much, that strange visitors came by night, that girls were summoned to serve, and sometimes they never came back. But these were only murmurs. In a feudal system where nobility ruled with absolute authority, there was no court, no consequence, no defense for the poor. A peasant girl could vanish, and no one would ask where she had gone. In the coming years, those whispers would grow louder, and Castle Choctich would become one of the most feared places in Eastern Europe. Choctich Castle rose from a rocky hilltop like a silent, watching sentinel. Stone walls worn by wind, foundations older than memory. It was not designed for comfort. Its thick ramparts were built for siege, its narrow stairwells designed to bottleneck enemies, and in the bitter winters of northern Hungary, the wind seemed to scream through its broken towers. This is where Elizabeth Bathory, now Countess Nadasdy, would live out most of her adult life. She arrived shortly after her marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy at the age of 14. The union was politically advantageous, joining two powerful Protestant noble families at a time when the Kingdom of Hungary was fracturing under pressure from both the Habsburg monarchy and the Ottoman Empire. The Nadasdy family was less prestigious than the Bathorys, but wealthier. To appease Elizabeth's higher station, Ferenc added her surname to his own, an unusual reversal for the time. The marriage was not rooted in affection. It was duty, dynasty, and strategy, the core of aristocratic life. Ferenc, 5 years older, was already consumed by military ambitions. He would go on to lead Hungarian forces in battle, becoming infamous for his brutal methods in the Long Turkish War, which began in 1593. While Ferenc marched against the Ottomans, Elizabeth was left to manage the household, the castle, and the surrounding lands. This included legal authority over hundreds of peasants across dozens of villages. She collected taxes, judged local disputes, and enforced punishments. In this feudal world, a noblewoman could act as judge, jailer, and executioner, and she did. Elizabeth's stewardship was efficient. She was intelligent, highly educated, and unwavering in her decisions. But records from the period also note her increasing harshness toward servants, especially young women. Most early complaints were minor: a servant beaten for laziness, a maid dismissed for theft. But over time, a pattern emerged. Girls entered service and were never seen again. The fortress itself offered cover. Chaktice was isolated, surrounded by forests, far from the political eyes of the capital. It was a place where secrets could be kept. The servants were mostly illiterate and poor. Their words, if spoken, carried no weight. And in a culture where corporal punishment was expected, even praised among the elite, cruelty could pass as discipline, especially from a woman with noble blood. Ferenc, too, was no stranger to violence. On the battlefield, he was called the Black Knight of Hungary, known for impaling prisoners, leaving villages in ruin, and wearing the severed heads of his enemies on spikes outside his tent. He was admired, even honored, for this brutality. Some historians believe it was Ferenc who introduced Elizabeth to new methods of punishment, not in war, but at home. The two were said to share a fascination with pain and with the idea that fear maintained order. Trial testimonies decades later describe a custom-made clawed glove, allegedly gifted to Elizabeth by Ferenc, used to tear the skin of disobedient maids. There are claims, from servants interrogated under torture, that the couple once watched a girl be smeared with honey and left outside for insects as punishment for a small mistake. But these details emerged long after Ferenc's death, and it is impossible to separate fact from the fear-soaked exaggerations of his accusers. What is certain is that during their marriage, dozens of young women passed through the castle doors, and some were never documented again. Despite the shadow behind the walls, Elizabeth maintained the outward appearance of a noblewoman. She bore 4 children, managed estates with precision, and maintained correspondence with distant relatives, including powerful members of the Bathory and Nadasdi clans. One of her closest associates during this time was a woman named Anna Darvulia, a former servant who became a personal confidant and, according to later accounts, a willing participant in acts of cruelty. Darvulia was older, more experienced, and said to be deeply involved in folk healing, herbalism, and what the church would have called witchcraft. She may have introduced Elizabeth to local beliefs about blood rituals, youthful essence, and dark preservation, ideas that would later become central to the accusations. But during Ferenc's lifetime, Elizabeth's more violent tendencies were likely kept in check. As long as her husband lived, she had an anchor to nobility and a barrier against scandal. That began to change in 1604, when Ferenc grew ill. After years of battle, his body failed. He returned home sick, likely from an infection or illness contracted during campaign. Over several months, he deteriorated. Paralysis took hold, and he could no longer speak. He died later that year, at just 48 years old. His death marked a turning point. Now a widow at 44, Elizabeth became the sole head of one of the largest estates in Hungary. She controlled hundreds of square miles of land, ruled over thousands of tenants, and no longer had a husband to answer to. She was rich, powerful, and completely untouchable in the feudal order. For a few years after Ferenc's death, she appeared to rule in peace. She moved between Chaktice Castle and other family holdings. Her wealth grew, but the stories began to intensify. By 1606, rumors from nearby villages spoke of girls taken for service and never seen again. Some locals began to keep their daughters hidden when the Countess's servants came recruiting. Elizabeth was no longer just feared. She was avoided. And yet, no one dared challenge her. The Hungarian nobility, even the king, were reluctant to investigate such a powerful widow. The Bathory name carried weight. Her family sat on thrones, held military command, and funded royal campaigns. To accuse her of wrongdoing would be politically risky. In those years, no amount of whispers could break the stone of privilege. Inside the castle, servants were rotated quickly. Some fled, others vanished, and the Countess grew more withdrawn, more secretive. There are accounts, again drawn from later trial documents, that Elizabeth began experimenting with folk remedies involving blood, believing that the vitality of young girls could restore her beauty or stave off illness. The most famous legend, that she bathed in the blood of virgins, has no direct mention in the original court records. It likely emerged decades or centuries later. But the core claim, that she believed blood could preserve youth, is found in some testimonies of the time. And still, no action was taken. Not by the church, not by the king, not by the nobility who visited her halls and drank her wine. Because in 17th century Hungary, the death of a peasant girl was not considered a crime worth prosecuting. Not until Elizabeth Bathory's ambition turned toward the noble daughters. Only then did her world begin to crumble. Chakta's castle was quiet in the winters, but the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, thickened by suspicion. Servants did not speak unless spoken to. Footsteps were soft. Eyes stayed low. By 1609, the rumors surrounding Elizabeth Bathory had become harder to ignore. Across the surrounding villages, Wachowsze, Bekov, Trencin, parents began refusing the Countess's servants when they arrived looking for help. The promise was simple: a few months' work at the castle, decent wages, and the prestige of serving a noble family. But more and more, the girls who accepted this offer were never seen again. At first, it was mostly peasant girls, the ones whose disappearances would not be questioned, the ones with no land, no name, no protection. In those years, a missing servant could be explained away with little effort. A runaway, an illness, an accident. The countryside was dangerous, they would say. A wolf in the forest. A cold that turned to fever. A girl who fled to escape disgrace. But over time, the pattern became harder to conceal. Word began to travel between households and among priests. Some said that Elizabeth Bathory had become unhinged since her husband's death, that she punished girls for the smallest errors, a wrinkle in a bedsheet, a stain on a dress, a misplaced glance. The punishments, they said, were far beyond what even noble cruelty would allow. Some claimed to have seen girls with missing fingers, severe burns or open wounds, working in silence. Others said blood was being scrubbed from the stones in the early mornings. A few claimed they had seen girls buried hastily near the edge of the castle grounds in shallow, unmarked graves. Elizabeth, now approaching her 50s, had surrounded herself with a small group of trusted servants and companions, individuals whose names would later surface in her trial. Among them were Anna Darvulia, Elizabeth's most intimate confidant, often described as a woman with deep knowledge of herbal poisons and strange rituals. Ilona Jo, Catalin Benica, and Dorothea Sentes, also known as Dorka, servants believed to be her closest accomplices, who carried out the punishments or helped dispose of bodies. Fichko, a disfigured manservant, who some claimed helped restrain victims during punishments. Whether these individuals acted willingly or under threat is still debated, but their loyalty to Elizabeth was unwavering until their arrest years later. Inside the castle, Elizabeth kept rigid control. She issued orders in 4 languages. She dictated the treatment of every servant, and she read every letter sent from the estate. She still hosted guests. She still oversaw the estate's taxes. But something had shifted. The line between noble discipline and sadism had begun to blur. One priest, István Magyari, reportedly confronted Elizabeth after officiating the funeral of a local girl who had died in her service. He later wrote a complaint to higher authorities, accusing the Countess of murder and torture. But the letter was ignored. The Bathory family's influence was too strong, and no one was willing to launch a formal investigation based on hearsay, especially from a priest with limited standing. Still, the stories multiplied. Some reached the royal court, and now the girls were no longer just peasants. Elizabeth, it is said, began accepting the daughters of lesser nobles for training, boarding girls from minor families, promising to educate them in etiquette, needlework, and courtly manners. For these families, sending a daughter to serve the Bathory household was a great honor. But when these noble daughters also began to vanish, the alarm was no longer contained to the countryside. One noble family sent word to György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, the highest-ranking official in the kingdom after the king himself. Thurzó had known Ferenc Nadasdy, Elizabeth's late husband. They had fought together in the Ottoman Wars, and Thurzó had long respected the Bathory name. But now he received formal complaints, one after another, signed, sealed, impossible to ignore. Some of the letters described what had been seen or heard by former servants. Others detailed the disappearances, dates, names, and families who were willing to speak on the record. For the first time, real pressure reached the royal court. King Matthias II, who owed the Bathory family a significant debt, gave Thurzó a quiet order. Investigate the countess, do it discreetly, and do not start a scandal unless absolutely necessary. Thurzó hesitated. Accusing a noble woman, especially one with family ties across Europe, was politically dangerous. If he moved too soon, he could face retribution. But if he waited too long, the kingdom itself could be accused of protecting a murderer. So he took the first step. He sent spies, not soldiers, but trusted informants, to the nearby villages to interview priests, speak to former servants, review death records, and document the names of missing girls. What they found was worse than expected. At least 35 families reported daughters gone missing in the past 10 years, all after entering Bathory's service. Some had never been recorded as leaving. A few claimed to have seen bodies smuggled out at night, covered in linen, carted to distant cemeteries. Several claimed that the Countess herself participated in beatings. One stated she had seen Elizabeth bite a servant's face, as if in frenzy. Another said she saw a girl bled slowly, as if the purpose was not punishment, but collection. These were testimonies still whispered, not yet sworn under oath. But Thurzó took them seriously. He assembled a file, quietly, meticulously, and waited. In 1610, with the whispers now impossible to silence, King Matthias gave permission to act. Thurzó was granted authority to enter Choctache Castle under the guise of a formal visit, but with orders to document everything he found. The date was set. December 29th, 1610, the coldest time of year, when the hills around the castle were frozen and still, when screams, if they came, would travel far through the silent valley. What Thurzo would find inside those walls would become one of the most infamous investigations in European history. But the night had not yet come. In the days before his arrival, Elizabeth Bathory moved through her chambers as she always had, calm, composed, and unchallenged. She could not know that the fortress she ruled like a kingdom was about to become her prison. She often wore black, not the dusty black of mourning, but a deep, gleaming velvet, embroidered with silver thread, stiff at the collar, high at the neck. Even in her 50s, Elizabeth Bathory was known for her elegance, her skin pale, her eyes sharp, her voice measured and commanding. Servants said she moved like smoke through the halls of Chaktich Castle, often unseen, yet never unnoticed. Some called her the Widow in Black, others, only in whispers, the Lady of Blood. But none said such things in her presence. To speak poorly of the Countess was to invite punishment, or worse. By late 1610, Elizabeth's household had dwindled. Trusted servants remained. The outer staff had turned over many times. Fearful mothers no longer sent daughters to her service, and villagers avoided the castle when they could. Only the poorest girls were still sent, or those brought in from far away. According to later testimony, a hidden room had been prepared deep within the castle, sometimes called the torture chamber, though this term may be a dramatic invention of later writers. Still, servants who testified during the trial described it in chilling detail: chains fixed to stone walls, iron tools, crude blades, whips with barbs, and wooden frames meant to bind the body in place. The existence of such a room was never officially confirmed. No blueprint survives, but multiple witnesses, separately and under oath, described similar things. One spoke of iron branding rods. Another described a cage-like structure that could be hoisted from the ceiling, used to restrain and spin a victim. Still others described drainage channels cut into the floor. What was certain is this: young girls died inside Chaktich, and their deaths were not quiet. The Countess, according to servant testimony, had grown more erratic in recent years. She was said to beat girls until her own hands bled. One account claimed she once sewed a girl's lips shut for speaking without permission. Another told of a girl stripped naked, forced to stand outside in the snow, doused with cold water, and left to freeze. Some stories grew stranger. There were whispers, uncorroborated but often repeated, about Elizabeth cutting her own skin and smearing herself with blood, as if drawn by something spiritual or something broken. Others claimed she collected blood in basins or soaked cloth in it and pressed it against her face. These details fed the later legend that she bathed in blood to preserve her youth. But historians agree this specific claim likely emerged after her death, possibly born of poetic exaggeration or folk myth. Still, it's not without root. Multiple testimonies describe Elizabeth using the blood of her victims in ritualistic ways and speak of her obsession with appearance, aging, and the vitality of the young. The woman once praised for her poise and intellect had become, by some accounts, obsessed with decay. Her correspondence slowed. Her public appearances ceased. She stopped visiting other estates. Letters she did send were increasingly cold, preoccupied with estate finances and legal technicalities, never personal. And all the while, girls continued to disappear. In early December 1610, just weeks before the castle's downfall, Elizabeth arranged what would be one of her last lessons. she had recently recruited several young noble girls under the promise of education and refinement. They came from minor families, names less powerful, but still protected by station. This was her mistake. According to testimonies from Thurzo's investigation, several of these girls died within days of arriving. Others were tortured and left to recover. One account claimed 2 girls died in a single night, their bodies hidden in a locked room before disposal could be arranged. Elizabeth's servants, now stretched thin, were forced to bury the dead quickly, some say beneath castle floors, others in nearby fields. But there were witnesses. A maid escaped. A stable boy spoke. A visiting priest smelled something rotting and asked questions. And by mid-December, Georgi Thurzo was already on his way. He brought with him a small group of armed men, cloaked in royal authority, but traveling without fanfare. The aim was discretion. The goal was to catch the Countess in the act, to see with their own eyes what had, until now, been buried in rumor and testimony. Thurzo was not a man of superstition. He had fought in wars. He had seen the inside of Turkish prisons. But what he would find in the upper chambers of Choctich was worse than battlefield carnage, because it bore the marks of intimacy, intention, and ritual. On the evening of December 29, 1610, they arrived. The sky was violet. Snow clung to the bare trees. No alarm was raised. The guards at the castle had not been warned. Thurzo entered through the main gates, announced himself, and demanded entry in the name of the king. What happened next would become the centerpiece of the case that followed. According to multiple written records, Thurzo and his men entered the main hall and were immediately struck by the scent: iron, sweat, decay. They followed the sound of movement and came upon a scene that would follow them to their graves. A girl lay barely alive, bleeding on the floor. Another was slumped in the corner, her limbs broken. A third was dead, partially covered, her mouth frozen open. Some versions say they found 4 bodies, others say only 2. But all agree it was enough. Thurzo ordered a full search of the castle. Over the next several hours, they uncovered a hidden room containing torture instruments, chains stained with blood, and personal belongings of missing girls. They found graves outside the castle, shallow and rushed. One servant led them to a place near the orchard, where at least 11 bodies had been buried over the past year. Elizabeth was placed under house arrest that very night. She did not resist. She did not speak in her defense. In some versions, she claimed she had done nothing wrong, that she had simply disciplined disobedient girls. In others, she said nothing at all. But it was over. The woman in black velvet was no longer untouchable. The blood that stained her floors could no longer be hidden beneath tapestries and stone. Thurzo returned to Bratislava with written statements and physical evidence. The trial would begin within weeks. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming testimony, Elizabeth Bathory would never speak another word in court. She would never testify. She would never be sentenced. She would never confess. Because the woman who ruled like a monarch would be judged without ever standing before her accusers. The trial of Elizabeth Bathory was not a trial in the traditional sense. There was no public courtroom, no dramatic cross-examination, no sentence handed down to the accused in chains. Because Elizabeth Bathory, one of the most powerful women in Europe, was never formally tried. Instead, the Hungarian crown and noble court made a quiet decision. She would be contained, her reputation erased, and the scandal buried beneath stone. But before that could happen, her servants were put on trial, and what they said under oath and under torture would shape the legacy of the woman history would call the Blood Countess. The proceedings began in January 1611, just weeks after her arrest. The presiding judge was royal notary Andras Keresturi, and the venue was the town of Bicha, far from the castle walls. The first to testify were Ilona Jo and Dorotia Sentes, Dorka, followed by Fichko, the disfigured servant. Later came Catalin Benica and other lower-ranking staff. All were interrogated, and many confessed under duress, some after torture sanctioned by the court. The numbers they gave were staggering. Some claimed the Countess had killed over 30 girls with her own hands. Others said the true number was closer to 80. Then, in one testimony, the number 600 was spoken aloud, a claim that would echo through centuries. That number came from one servant, who said that Elizabeth kept a ledger, a secret diary recording the names of each girl who had died in her care. This book, she said, contained over 650 entries, but no such diary was ever produced. No one saw it during the investigation. Its existence remains unproven. Still, the number stuck. Not because it was verified, but because it confirmed something already suspected, that the crimes were not isolated. They were not accidents. They were systematic. The servants described how the girls were chosen: young, healthy, usually virgins. Most were peasant-born, lured with promises of paid work. Others were daughters of lesser nobility sent for courtly education. All were under the Countess's complete authority once inside the castle. According to sworn testimony, girls were stripped naked and examined. Some were beaten with wooden clubs, others with barbed whips. Some were starved for days, then forced to eat burning coals. Others had flesh pinched with iron tongs or were stabbed with long needles beneath the fingernails. One was allegedly covered in honey and left outdoors for insects to feed. Another was said to be sewn into the body of a dead horse, a punishment so grotesque even the judge recoiled when the story was told. Many testimonies also described the role of blood. Witnesses claimed Elizabeth would cut the girls with blades, collecting the blood in bowls or cloth. She would then wash her hands and face with it, sometimes applying it as a mask. One servant swore that Elizabeth once stood beneath a girl suspended by the wrists and allowed the blood to drip directly onto her skin. And yet, there was still no mention in these trial records of the now famous blood bath. The idea that Elizabeth bathed in blood appears to have been added decades later, likely by storytellers, pamphlet writers, or political enemies seeking to amplify the horror. Still, the trial testimonies suggest that blood was central to the rituals or punishments, depending on one's interpretation. Some scholars today suggest that Elizabeth may have suffered from mental illness, worsened by epilepsy, possible head trauma, grief, and isolation. Others argue that she was simply a product of unchecked aristocratic cruelty, raised in a world where servants had no value and violence was a demonstration of power. And there is another theory, darker still, that Elizabeth Bathory believed blood could preserve her youth. This idea, though never proven, is not without historical precedent. In Renaissance Europe, alchemists and mystics spoke of vital essences, life humors, and spiritual transference. Blood, being the essence of life, was sometimes thought to contain magical properties. Combined with her documented obsession with appearance and her close association with folk healers like Anna Darvulia, it is not impossible that Elizabeth came to believe that the youth of the girls could be absorbed, or at least symbolically stolen. During the trial, over 300 witnesses were heard. Some were former servants, Others were priests, local nobles, or villagers who had reported their daughters missing. Several produced letters of complaint, written years earlier but ignored at the time. These documents were now accepted as part of the official record. Still, some defenders of Elizabeth remained. A few nobles protested that she was being targeted for political reasons, that her family's power had become inconvenient to the crown. Others said the testimonies were unreliable, gathered under torture, and fueled by superstition. One of her sons-in-law even attempted to delay or block the proceedings, fearing the shame it would bring upon their house. But by then, it was too late. The case had grown beyond rumor. Graves had been found, bodies exhumed. The king himself had seen the reports. On January 25, 1611, 3 of Elizabeth's servants, Ilona Jo, Dorka, and Fichko, were sentenced to death. Ilona and Dorka had their fingers torn off with hot pincers, then were burned alive. Fichko, considered less guilty due to his supposed mental impairment, was beheaded and burned. Others received lesser sentences. Some were imprisoned. Some vanished from record. And Elizabeth? She was spared execution, not out of mercy, but out of politics. To publicly execute a noblewoman of royal blood, connected by lineage to the King of Poland, the princes of Transylvania, and multiple Catholic and Protestant dynasties, would have set a dangerous precedent. Instead, the court ruled that she would be confined, not to a prison, but to her own castle. She would be sealed inside a set of private chambers, the doors bricked shut, with only small openings for food and air. It was a punishment designed not to humiliate her in public, but to erase her silently, a death by isolation. A sentence passed not in the streets, but between the lines of royal letters. Elizabeth Bathory, the woman who once ruled vast lands, hosted nobles, and commanded armies of servants, was now alone in the dark, and she would never be seen again in public. In the months following her confinement, Elizabeth Bathory disappeared from public life, not metaphorically, but physically. Her private quarters at Chaktica Castle were sealed by masonry, by order of Palatine Georgi Thurzo, and sanctioned by the king. One chamber, no doors, just a small slot for meals, and a narrow slit in the stone for light and air. No visitors, no letters, no court, no defense. She became, quite literally, a ghost behind the walls. There is no surviving record of what her cell looked like, only that it was located in the upper part of the castle and guarded at all times. Guards reported she paced constantly in the early weeks, that she refused food at first, that she sometimes whispered to herself or called out to those who no longer served her. No trial, no testimony, no final statement. She was neither exonerated nor condemned, only erased. Outside, her name began to rot. As the investigation spread and court documents were copied, rumors exploded across Hungary and beyond. Pamphlets, letters, and whispers at court carried the name Bathory farther than her crimes ever had. And at the heart of this storm was a document that may never have existed. The diary. It was first mentioned by a single servant during the trial. She claimed Elizabeth had kept a written ledger, a personal record of every girl she had punished or killed or watched die. She said there were over 650 names written inside. No such diary was ever found. It was never entered into court evidence. No copies, no fragments. No one else claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. And yet, the very suggestion of it was enough, because it implied something far more chilling than rage or madness, it suggested method, that these were not random acts of violence, but deliberate, tracked, ritualized, that each girl, each life, had been recorded, preserved on paper long after her body had been discarded. The idea of the secret diary haunted the record, even as historians remained divided. Some believe it was a lie, an invention extracted under torture, meant to satisfy the judge's expectations. Others suggest it was destroyed before the castle was searched. A few, even now, believe it may have been hidden, buried among the remains of a crumbling fortress, or concealed by relatives seeking to protect what remained of the Bathory name. But with or without the diary, there was already too much to ignore. By early 1612, the king's agents had compiled an official summary of the case. It listed dozens of witnesses, statements from servants, graves uncovered, and bodies exhumed. It did not include the diary, but it did note the claim of over 600 victims, not as confirmed fact, but as a reported statement from the trial. That number took on a life of its own. It appeared in letters, in royal memos, in regional folklore, and by the 18th century, it had become a permanent fixture in the myth of Elizabeth Bathory. She had become more than a criminal. She had become a figure of horror. Writers and storytellers turned her into a caricature of evil, a woman who bathed in blood, who drank the essence of virgins, who seduced and slaughtered in the name of vanity. Her story became allegory, warning, and entertainment. But in the historical record, Elizabeth remained silent. She never spoke publicly again. No letters survive from her final year. Her children did not visit. The Bathory family, once defenders of her reputation, began to distance themselves. Some relatives even argued over her property before her death, fearing that the crown would seize it upon her passing. The quiet bricking of her chamber was not just punishment, it was erasure. And yet, the legend continued to swell. Because even without a public execution, even without a trial transcript signed in her own hand, the facts were more than enough to stir the imagination. In private, European noble courts began referring to her not by name, but by epithet. The Lady of Chaktich, the Black Widow of the North, the Tigress of Transylvania, the Countess Dracula. This last one, popularized only centuries later, linked her infamy to Vlad the Impaler, her rumored distant relative. Though no historical connection exists between their personalities or motivations, both figures became twisted together in later folklore and Gothic fiction. But in reality, Elizabeth Bathory was not a vampire. She was a noblewoman, a widow, a ruler of vast lands, and by overwhelming testimony, a serial killer. Her wealth and gender had shielded her from scrutiny for decades, but her own obsession, perhaps with power or youth or blood, had finally outgrown even the thick walls of her fortress. And now, she was alone. As the world darkened beyond her window slit and the seasons shifted once again, there were no candles lit for her, no public prayer, no final audience. Only whispers, only rumors, and the eternal question. Did she really believe that blood could stop time? Long before Palatine Thurzo stepped into the bloody halls of Chaktich Castle, others had already seen what lay beneath the surface. The village priests. They were the first to hear the weeping, the confessions, the sudden silences when mothers spoke of missing daughters. They presided over hurried funerals for girls with no known cause of death. They blessed graves that should have been inspected. And they said nothing. Not at first. Not when the victims were peasants. not when the Countess was still untouchable. Because in the Kingdom of Hungary in the early 1600s, a noblewoman's will was law, and a priest's duty was obedience to the church, to the king, and often to the local lord or lady who paid for the roof above their altar. Elizabeth Bathory donated to churches. She attended Mass. She kept a personal chaplain, and when girls died on her estate, she made sure a priest was summoned. The first whispers of suspicion can be traced back to around 1602, nearly a decade before her arrest. A priest named István Magyari, who served in Sarvar, wrote to higher authorities to raise concern about the deaths of young girls in the Countess's care. Magyari had officiated the burial of at least 2 servants whose injuries did not match natural causes. He had seen wounds hidden beneath funeral clothing. He had asked questions. His warnings, at the time, were dismissed. The complaints went up the chain, but died there. The Bathory name carried weight, and priests who pressed too hard were seen as disruptive, especially Protestant ones, in a land torn between Reformation and Catholic counter-Reformation. Magyari persisted. He wrote a formal letter to King Matthias. In it, he accused Elizabeth of murder and requested an investigation. This time, the message stuck. The king did not act immediately, but Magyari's concerns were now part of the official record. When Thurzo began his quiet inquiry years later, it was Magyari's letter that provided early justification for the palace to proceed. Still, for nearly a decade, the church remained largely silent. Other priests had buried girls who died in Elizabeth's service. Some had blessed coffins that no one was allowed to open. A few must have seen signs, bruises, cuts, swelling, or the absence of family at the graveside. But in those days, to accuse a noblewoman of crime was to court ruin. And Elizabeth knew this. She understood power. She understood ritual and respectability. She presented herself in fine clothing, attended Mass, donated land and silver. Her public piety was a shield, and so long as the victims were poor, the clergy turned away. But the problem grew. By 1609, she had begun recruiting young noblewomen, the daughters of minor aristocrats. These girls came with baptism records, family ties, and social expectation. Their deaths could not be buried quietly. It was around this time that a second priest, Father Paul Magyari, recorded his suspicions in parish ledgers. He noted that the number of funerals from Chaktiche had increased dramatically, and that many of the dead were young women from distant regions. He wrote that, "The grief of the mothers is silenced by fear, and no man dares challenge the hand of the Countess." Even then, no direct accusation was made, only unease, only shadows cast on paper. And when Thurzo arrived at Chaktiche in December 1610, the first people he spoke to were the priests. Some gave guarded answers. Some denied knowledge. But others confessed what they had suspected all along, that Elizabeth had been killing for years, and that no one had dared stop her. The trial records include the names of several clergymen who later corroborated the witness testimonies. They confirmed burials without proper rites, families too afraid to speak, and girls taken into service who never returned. Still, none could say how many had died. There were no records, no death certificates, no legal requirement to track servants who had no inheritance, no surname, and no social standing. They were invisible until they vanished completely. And so the church's role in the Bathory case became one of silent complicity, not participation, not endorsement, but silence, a refusal to act, a refusal to see. In the years following her arrest, Elizabeth Bathory became a symbol of moral corruption, but few sermons mentioned the failures of the pulpit, the priests who had stood beside her in Mass, who had accepted her donations, who had buried her victims without question. None were punished, because the guilt of the Church was not in action, but in inaction, and that made it harder to name. Later writers would claim that Elizabeth engaged in satanic rituals, that she summoned spirits, or read black books of forbidden knowledge, but no evidence from the time supports this. The accusations of witchcraft were largely absent from her trial, unlike in other cases of female persecution across Europe. Elizabeth Bathory was not charged with sorcery. She was not burned at the stake. She was not seen as a witch. She was seen as a noble woman who had gone too far, a woman whose gender and status protected her until she extended her violence beyond what her station could shield. And when the priests finally spoke, it was too late. By the time they raised their voices, hundreds of girls were already gone, their names never recorded, their bodies hidden in forest graves, castle cellars, or beneath chapel floors. Their stories could not be told. So Elizabeth's became the only one remembered. A memory wrapped in black velvet, a legend soaked in rumor, a history lined with silence. In the high chamber of Chaktiche Castle, the woman who once ruled villages with a signature, who rode in carriages drawn by 12 horses, who wore gowns stitched with silver, was now sealed behind stone. The orders came directly from Palatine Georgi Thurzo. Elizabeth Bathory was not to be executed, not to be transported, not even to be tried. Instead, she would be confined to a room in her own castle, with no door, no freedom, and no visitors. A brick wall was built across the entrance to her suite, leaving only 2 narrow openings, one for light and air, and one for passing food. She would spend the rest of her life in complete isolation. She was 50 years old. The decision not to execute her was not mercy. It was politics. The Bathory family was still powerful. Her cousins sat in noble courts. One relative was the Prince of Transylvania. Another held high office in Poland. To publicly try and hang Elizabeth could have sparked noble unrest. So Thurzo, acting on behalf of King Matthias II, imposed the next best thing: permanent disappearance. She would never be seen again, never heard from, never allowed to speak to the world that once obeyed her. What she thought in those final years, we do not know. No letters survive. No official records describe her behavior in confinement. No priest was sent to her chamber. No confessor documented her last thoughts. She was, in every sense, buried alive. The castle walls that had once protected her now became her prison. The grand windows looked out onto nothing. The stone floors that echoed with footsteps now heard only silence. Some guards later said she paced constantly in the early days, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting to no one. Others claimed she refused food, that she grew thin, that her hair grayed rapidly, that she stood at the air slit and watched the sun rise and fall without speaking. But these are only stories, passed down through second-hand letters, rumors, and castle lore. None can be proven. The only confirmed detail is her death. On the night of August 20th, 1614, a guard passing by the wall claimed he heard her speaking. She said, "I am very cold." The next morning, she did not respond when called. When the bricks were removed, whether in full or in part, the Countess of Chaktiche was found dead, lying on the floor of her chamber. She had spent 3.5 years in solitary confinement. There was no public mourning, no funeral procession, no tomb carved with her name. Her body was buried quickly. Some say it was placed in the local church at Chakticha. Others claim the villagers demanded her remains be moved, too afraid to let her rest among them. A document from 1614 suggests she was finally interred at the Bathory family crypt in Exid, far from the site of her crimes. But to this day, her final resting place has never been found. Like so much of her life, her death was quietly covered, disappeared, and yet the silence could not contain her story. In the years that followed, travelers came to Chakticha to see the place where she had lived and died. Peasants pointed to cracked walls, burned beams, and said, "That is where she bled them." Stories were told to children. Don't go near the castle after dark. Don't speak the Countess's name aloud. Don't walk barefoot near the old orchard. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory began to grow, even as the walls crumbled. In the 1700s, German and Hungarian pamphlets retold her story, embellishing with each generation. She bathed in blood, they claimed. She killed a girl every full moon. She turned into a raven at night. She cursed the land with her dying breath. None of this was written in her lifetime, but it no longer mattered. The name Bathory was now tied not to Transylvanian nobility, but to death, to blood, youth, and madness. Writers in the 19th century gave her a new title, the Blood Countess. She was likened to Vlad the Impaler, despite no meaningful connection. And when Bram Stoker's Dracula appeared in 1897, readers began drawing lines between vampirism and Elizabeth's crimes, not because history demanded it, but because myth fills the space where silence lives. Chaktich Castle was eventually abandoned. Its stones were looted, its roof collapsed. Only fragments remain, yet travelers still visit. They climb the hill in silence, through thorn and ash, to see the ruins where a woman once ruled with velvet gloves and a voice like commandment. They walk the stones where servants once wept. They touch the walls where blood was scrubbed clean again and again. And they ask, even now, did she really believe blood could make her young again? The answer has never been found. What we know is this. Dozens of girls died in her care. Servants confessed to their roles. Bones were found, graves uncovered, witnesses recorded. And a woman of immense wealth and education used her power to bring unimaginable suffering. Was she a monster? A product of aristocratic cruelty? A madwoman or a cold rationalist with no moral compass? Perhaps all of these. But what history makes clear is that for years, no one stopped her. Not the church, not the court, not the nobles who dined in her halls, and not the world that watched from a distance, unsure if the horror could possibly be true. It was. The names were never written down, not officially. No ledger was ever recovered. No list of victims was preserved in the records of the royal court. No memorial was raised for the girls who vanished behind the walls of Chakticha Castle. There may have been hundreds. There may have been far fewer. The number most often whispered, 650, came from the mouth of a single servant under duress, speaking of a secret book that no other soul claimed to have seen. But whether it was 30 or 60 or 600, the result was the same. Not a single name survived. The girls who died in Elizabeth Bathory's care were almost entirely peasants. They were born in fields and kitchens, baptized in village chapels, and vanished without a trace. Many were too poor to own more than a single dress. Some were orphaned. Others were sold into servitude by desperate families. Their deaths were not registered. Their bodies, when found, were anonymous. Their identities, like their voices, were lost in silence. No gravestones, no birth records matched to corpses. No mourning songs passed down through generations. Just disappearance. And yet, Elizabeth Bathory has become one of the most famous women in history. Her name is known, her face painted, her crimes repeated in books, films, and tales whispered before sleep. But the girls? They remain nameless. The question echoes across time. How does a crime of this scale leave no trace of its victims? The answer lies in the society that allowed it. In the Kingdom of Hungary in the early 17th century, the life of a noble was worth pages of record-keeping. Titles, estates, births, and marriages filed in archives that still survive today. But a servant girl? A peasant child? She was not a citizen. She was not documented. She had no rights in the eyes of the law. If she disappeared, no one came looking. If she was buried in secret, no priest asked questions. If she screamed, her voice did not echo beyond stone. This was structural invisibility, a violence beyond the physical, a society so rigidly shaped by class, gender, and power that entire lives could vanish without acknowledgement. Elizabeth Bathory did not invent this system, but she used it, and the very architecture of feudal Europe, its laws, its hierarchy, its silence, made her crimes possible and protected her for years. Even her punishment was crafted to protect others. The Bathory family retained most of their lands. Her children inherited her wealth. Her trial was quietly sealed. The palace made no public statement. There was no royal decree, no published findings. Just rumors. Just whispers. And the number? 650. Over time, this number became mythic, not because it was confirmed, but because it was believable. Because those who came after could see the pattern. A noble woman with unchecked power, a court that delayed justice, a priesthood that looked away, and servants who obeyed until they were broken. Even when the bodies were found, buried shallow in orchards and stables, no one asked who they were. No attempt was made to identify them, because their value ended with their death. The official Hungarian court documents, preserved today in fragments, mention a few names of survivors, not victims. These included Susanna, a maid who escaped and testified, Anna Darvulia, the Countess's alleged right hand, Ilona Jo, Dorka, and Fichko, executed as her accomplices, but the victims remain nameless. This is the deepest horror of the Elizabeth Bathory case. Not just the cruelty, but the erasure. She is remembered. They are not. And yet, their suffering laid the foundation for her legend. Their blood gave shape to the stories. Their silence still surrounds her name. In recent years, some scholars and historians have sought to re-examine the case. A few have argued that Elizabeth was framed, that the testimonies were coerced, and that the number of victims was wildly exaggerated to strip her of her estate. They point to contradictions in witness accounts, the political motivations of Thurzo, and the lack of surviving forensic evidence. But even among revisionists, one truth remains. Young women died at Chaktich Castle. And those deaths, whatever their number, were not investigated until it was too late. Even if the final count was 30, not 600, it would still represent one of the most egregious failures of justice in European noble history. And to this day, the name Elizabeth Bathory stands as a symbol of what power can protect, what fear can silence, and what history can forget. We tell her story again and again. We write her name. We debate her motives. But they, the girls she destroyed, remain shadows. The number is all we have. And that number is not justice. It is absence. The ruins of Choctaw Castle still stand. High on a hill in western Slovakia, then northern Hungary, the wind moves through its crumbling stones like a whisper of what was once unspeakable. The walls are broken. The roof is gone. Wild grass grows through the foundation, where once candles flickered, where silk rustled, where screams, perhaps, were swallowed by stone. There is no plaque to name the dead, no statue to name the Countess. Only shadow and silence, and yet, this silence is not empty. It holds centuries of stories. In the modern day, Elizabeth Bathory lives on in fiction, elevated, distorted, transformed. She appears in novels, films, horror games, even Gothic fashion lines. She is called the Blood Countess, the female Dracula, the immortal lady. Some stories depict her as a victim, others as a monster. Few remember her as what she most certainly was, a human being, born into power, educated, clever, and capable of profound cruelty. And perhaps that's what makes her story linger. Because she wasn't a creature of the night. She wasn't a witch. She wasn't a vampire. She was a noblewoman, raised in a court of privilege and brutality, educated in Latin and law, trained to command households, negotiate marriage alliances, and manage lands as large as cities. And she used that training, that intelligence, and that power, according to overwhelming testimony, to torture and kill. Over and over, she was protected by the very system that would eventually bury her. It was not until she crossed the boundaries of class, harming young noblewomen, not just peasants, that justice stirred. And even then, it came not in the form of trial or confession or judgment by peers, but in a quiet sealing away, a brick tomb, a political compromise. She was not tried, because her trial would expose too much. She was not executed, because her bloodlines reached too high. She was not forgotten, because what she did cast a shadow no wall could hold. Today, historians continue to debate the details. Did she really kill 600 girls? Was there truly a diary? How much of the legend was exaggerated or invented by her enemies? The answers may never be found. Because so much of her story lives in absence, the absence of victim names, the absence of consistent records, the absence of justice. Even her final resting place is uncertain. For years, a stone slab in Choctaw's churchyard was believed to mark her grave, but it was exhumed and found empty. Some say her body was moved secretly to the Bathory family crypt in Exed. Others believe it was hidden or lost or never buried at all. Perhaps the earth itself refused to hold her, but her castle remains. Visitors still climb the rocky path, through trees gnarled by centuries, past walls pocked with time and fire. They stand in silence beneath what may have been her chambers, and they wonder. Not about her evil. That much is accepted. They wonder how it was allowed, how so many could die, quietly, invisibly, beneath the watch of servants, priests, courtiers, and kings. And that is the story we must remember. Not the one dressed in blood and velvet, but the one rooted in systemic blindness, social cruelty, and fear. Elizabeth Bathory's life teaches us nothing if we only see her as a monster. The lesson lies in how the world around her enabled her. In the silence of the castle, the silence of the clergy, the silence of the state, and in the centuries of silence that followed. Today, Choctysha Castle is visited not only by tourists, but by historians, folklorists, and curious travelers hoping to glimpse some echo of what happened there. But the stones are mute. They do not speak the names of the lost. They do not explain the ledger that never surfaced. They do not confess. They only remain. And in that silence we remember what was taken. Not just lives, but memory itself. So the next time someone tells you about Elizabeth Bathory, about the countess who bathed in blood, pause and ask not what she became in myth, but who was forgotten in her shadow. The castle may be ruined, but the silence, that silence, is whole. If you're still with us, allow your mind to rest now in the silence of the ruined castle. And when you're ready to drift further into the forgotten corners of history, there is another tale waiting, not in Europe this time, but across the Atlantic. In a cold village called Salem, beneath gray skies and Puritan hymns, fear once took root in the minds of the faithful. Accusations turned to trials, neighbors turned to enemies, and before it ended, innocent lives were claimed, not by blades or walls, but by the weight of belief itself. We invite you to continue with our next episode, The Salem Witch Trials, a shocking true story from 1692. Until then, sleep deeply. And remember, history never truly sleeps.